Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 36th installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation webinar series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO at Project MedTech. Today, we'll be hearing from Matt Eisendrath and Adam Hesse at Full Spectrum for a conversation on how MedTech lives at the bleeding edge of innovation and how to adapt. The medical device industry has evolved significantly over the decades, with changes often linked to product and technology innovation, policy, FDA regulation, standard of care, and reimbursement. The pattern has generally been that a change occurs, and over time the industry and associated products evolve in response, then settling into a new normal, awaiting for the next change. Today we are seeing the nodes of change coming with increased frequency, resulting in accelerated overall rate of change. Original equipment manufacturers, or OEMs, of MedTech solutions need to adapt more frequently with less time, and in some cases no time, to settle with the new normal. Some of the key takeaways we'll be touching on today are understanding why the rate of change is real, has put MedTech into a new leading edge position and is here to stay. What are the implications for medical device manufacturers, threats and opportunities, and strategies for being proactive about leveraging this change and effectively navigating accelerated innovation? First, a few housekeeping slides and some information on Galen Data. Galen Data is an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. The company is ISO 13485 certified, and the product on AWS is High Trust certified as well. Founded by seasoned medical device professionals, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics on the right-hand side of your screen or on your control panel. It could be on the left, it could be above. You'll see a few things. There's a place there where you can ask questions. I'll be monitoring that throughout Matt and I's conversation today. And so if there's questions, I'll kind of pop them in if they're relevant. If not, we'll save them for the Q&A that'll take place at the end, where Matt will be joined by another colleague of his, Adam, for the Q&A session. There's also a spot here as well for handouts. And so in the handouts section, you'll see a couple things. You'll see a Galen Data sheet, and then you'll also see a white paper on device cloud connectivity as well. So with that being said, you'll also, as a reminder, receive a recording of the webinar via email, and feel free to follow up with us should you have any additional questions. With that being said, Matt, welcome to the Galen Data webinar series. I'd like to introduce our guest today, Matt Eisendrath, President and Chief Commercial Officer at Full Spectrum. Matt is an innovative leader within the life sciences and medical device industry, joining Full Spectrum after leading medical device and life sciences in the Americas for Capgemini. I hope I didn't screw that up. A proven strategic thinker and leader with over 20 years in the healthcare industry, Matt has experience leading and growing businesses and divisions that maintain high and differentiated value in the market. I'm going to do a quick intro to Adam, even though he's not here yet technically, but Adam Hesse is the Executive Vice President of Engineering at Full Spectrum. He's a seasoned technical leader and entrepreneur. Adam brings more than 20 plus years of medical device, healthcare information systems, and machine vision experience to Full Spectrum, coming most recently from a leadership role in BD, or Becton Dickinson's diabetes division, and leading a major modernization program of Medtronic's CareLink platform before that. Matt, now welcome.
Dwayne, very good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Matt, let's just kind of jump into everything we're going to talk about today. But I think to start, how has the pace, we talked about the pace of MedTech change, right? How has the pace of technology adoption in MedTech, in the MedTech industry, changed over the years? So maybe like a little bit of history here, kind of moving into the rate of change increase we alluded to in the intro.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and yeah, I think a little context always helps, right? I mean, if we go back traditionally within the MedTech industry, for good reason, medical device companies tended to lag behind in the adoption of technology, making sure it's proven out. This goes back to the first do no harm concept in medicine in general. And just the way of thinking, it's slow to adopt because it's evidence-based. New things have to be tried out for a long time, and thought leadership will usually, if it's within one of the societies or specialties, there might be a thought leader trying a new technique, and they're gathering data through a clinical study, and they're presenting it, and it slowly gets proven out and rolled out to a broader audience in time. And it's not that things have become hasty, but I think MedTech had the ability to kind of hang back for a long time. Some of these evolutions were slow. We started with mechanical devices at first, and then electromechanical, and then software got involved, sort of in the 70s a bit, but more in the 90s. What we're seeing is that the delay, A, in some of the adoption of these technologies, and B, some of the regulation around it has gotten into a bit of a fast forward, where going from that wait and see, we find ourselves today, if you listen to Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, when he talks about Google AI, one of the first use cases, the first use case that he talks about is healthcare. And that to me is sort of the indication of where the industry has gone from really a wait and see, and let's be very, very careful, to there are opportunities to improve health, and there are opportunities to improve the practice of medicine. We can't wait around too long. We really have to start investigating these more quickly. And I think the AI is a great example. Is one that people are really talking about quite a bit. But I think it's the latest example, and I think it's an example of these waves of change that we talked about, the nodes of change starting to come more quickly to the industry and starting to become incorporated more quickly in the industry. And so it's really a cultural change as much as sort of a rate of change with the technology.
Yeah, Matt, it's a good point. I mean, we talk to Project MedTech. We have a lot of startups we're working with. It's pretty much exclusively who we work with, and we oftentimes explain to them, you're selling to one of the most conservative industries that I know of, right? I'm sure there's other ones that are potentially more conservative, but healthcare generally is very, very conservative. No matter how fast we're adopting new technology, it's a conservative industry because it is evidence-based. It's also, we're talking about life or death, right? And so I would prefer that my doctor is using things that we know aren't going to kill me, right? And if you talk to any clinician, I mean, almost any clinician always, that's their duty, right? To have a skeptical eye towards whatever we're talking about, right? I mean, even within my own house, my wife's a physical therapist. I'm in this, this med tech consulting role, and I'll see technology all the time that's applicable for physical therapy. She's always skeptical, as well she should. She's a clinician, right? So are you kind of seeing, though, that maybe clinicians are still skeptical, they're just adopting technology sooner? Because this is one of the big factors. And the next question I'm going to ask is, what factors are most impacting the pace of innovation, right? And we'll get to that. But curious on the clinician side of the people who are deploying these technologies, are they becoming more okay with some of the new technology, or are we just getting better at providing the data they need in order to adopt it?
I think there's both, right? There's generational things that are happening. When I first got involved in, early in my career, was around medical imaging. And it was, before 3D imaging was available on every workstation. It was when 3D imaging really wasn't being used, wasn't available. and we had a technology that took CT scans and converted into 3D images before that was really a common thing. And it was slow, right? It was slow to be adopted. There was a very strong, I mean, I think as we all know now, 3D imaging has a very strong value proposition. You know, in particular, what I was working on was vascular grafts, so like stents, but covered stents for aneurysms. And the traditional approach was open surgery, and this was on the aorta specifically. That's a very traumatic surgery. So here's this opportunity to go in through the femoral artery, avoid this traumatic incision to get at the aorta. And it was, as you say, you know, slowly adopted because let's get the evidence. That there was another side of it though, that was this involves putting a CD in a laptop and opening up a viewer and looking at a 3D model. And generationally, a lot of people struggled with that. I mean, I think, and there's still people who are a little phobic of technology, but I think much less so, right? So you have a clinician base that I think is more technologically savvy, is part of it. But I also think there is a change in the willingness to try new things. You know, part of this is, you know, when the iPhone came out, you know, within a few years of that, I was in conversations, you know, in engineering services, and I kept on hearing people say, you know, I want a better user interface. I want it to be more like the iPhone. And, you know, that was an example of, you know, consumer electronics all of a sudden setting the bar of expectation around what is this experience going to be like that started impacting demand and expectation. And it no longer was okay to, you know, look like you were playing Pong. You had to be, you know, playing Fortnite all of a sudden.
Yeah, no, I love the example. So let's talk about some of the factors most impacting the pace of innovation, whether it's negative or positive, or you know, it could go either way. What are, I mean, I alluded to some of these things, right? Policy, which policy around healthcare, right? That's
Yep.
always a big one. We alluded to FDA or regulations,
Yeah.
and I think the other one we alluded to in there was just in terms of like technological advancements, right? You bring up a good point, right? I mean, we all have an iPhone, right? Or Android, whatever. We all have smartphones, though.
Yep.
I mean, with the access to so much, everybody has it, right? I mean, I as I was preparing for this, I was going through my background's as a medicinal chemist, and I can remember having to memorize the periodic table, which is on the wall next to me, and how much oxygen weighed and what it like to bond with, and polar and non-polar, and what happens in reactions, and now there's no need for it. I can access any of that in a split second, right? So anyways, lots changing. Kind of walk me through some of these factors that are most impacting the pace of innovation.
Yeah, and you know, I'll walk through a few, and I'm certainly, you know, curious to hear some of yours from your experience as well. But I think there's a number. You know, let's start with policy, right? You know, the Affordable Care Act, which gets a lot of credit for adoption of EMR digitization, it was actually preceded by the High Tech Act, which pushed that initiative even beforehand and funded that transition into electronic medical records, upon which the Affordable Care Act actually, you know, based a lot of its policy, making the assumption that that was going to be successful, which it has, you know, very largely been successful. That's important, right? Because that was a you know, a governmental policy push to get out of paper-based records and get more data available in electronic format, right? And that is a significant change. You know, we're seeing some of the drivers today, right? I mean, we'll keep going with the policy, but the policy does marry up with the technology, and you can see the relationship. You know, beyond the ACA, there's the Cures Act, which has a big piece on interoperability among electronic health records and broader access to healthcare data, broader access to a provider who might not be the provider who was involved with an earlier study, but wanting all that information to be available. So you have the digitization of information, which makes it available in a whole different way. Then you have the access and interoperability of that information. And that has been, a fundamental shift in the availability of data. I think if we sort of follow that line, we can talk about connectivity and get into connectivity, but there's a number of drivers of connectivity. It's not all about the data. There's certainly other, use cases and value drivers, such as, remotely updating software. But absolutely one of the drivers is to get the data off the device or to put some kind of data on the device. And, so you see the policy that sort of made fertile ground for a lot of what has happened since then, which is a lot more is being done about data. There's population health management was sort of something that sprung out of that and the availability of data. Let's look at bigger populations, look at trends, let's look at, situations that might alert us to a patient that we should intervene earlier, maybe, avoid a more significant event. So, there was policy that set the stage for some of the trends in products, and that's one element. Then there's the technology itself, as you mentioned, and not all of these are new technologies, but I think what we're seeing is sort of the culmination of a lot of different changes and a synergy between them. Compute power, cloud computing, right? That's not today's technology, but it is a technology that today is still very much evolving, right? I mean, it's not like Bluetooth is a great technology, but it's a wireless communication technology that can be used instead of some other options that you may have. Cloud computing is more game changing, right? It fundamentally changes the model more. It gives the ability of compute power associated with it that can, run algorithms in some cases, and AI and machine learning, and also aggregate data in a way that wasn't as possible when everything was sort of standalone on a hard drive or in a hospital or care setting, not getting shared more broadly. So the cloud and the compute power associated with it, connectivity and the availability of data, which is really still going on. I mean, in this case, there still are a lot of medical devices that are not connected, but I think probably in the work that you do, and certainly in the work that I do, we work with a lot of new products that are being developed. It's very rare we see one that doesn't have connectivity as part of that. The smartphones we talked about, right? I mean, and I think again, the smartphones, I think people have a tendency to get used to things quickly. I mean, I think as humans, we adapt to things very quickly, and we forget, what it was like, pre-2006, when nobody had a smartphone. It was very different, and today it's ubiquitous, right? I mean, it is everywhere, and that opens up a whole set of use cases. It also starts to expand this ecosystem, right? You had a time when really medical devices were a box of some sort. Maybe it's therapeutic, maybe it's diagnostic or otherwise. Now we tend to think of things more as systems as well, right? And these systems are driven by, maybe there's the local medical device, maybe there's an associated mobile app. Sometimes you're controlling the device or monitoring it from the app. Sometimes the mobile device is a gateway to a back end or other ways to connect the device, but really the data. So the data is now flowing around among a bigger system, and you have all these pieces of the system that have their own growth patterns, and they're really playing off each other to create, the situation that we're in, where you have bigger, more sprawling medical devices that are connected, and to the FDA's thinking, not all of that system is a medical device, right? So thinking about the system, the role it plays, and then really what do we need to think about as the medical device that has regulatory implications, cost implications, risk implications, and the rest of it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So there's a presentation I saw at a conference in San Diego in April called the 10X Medical Device Conference. And a guy by the name of Nick Anderson gave a presentation, and he's actually going to be speaking at the Houston Startup Symposium at the end of October, which is sponsored by Galen Data. And he gave this kind of graph on innovation. And at the bottom half of the graph, like in the bottom corner, was low tech, low cost, high accessibility. And then innovation eventually scales up, and you get to this point at the top where it's high cost, high tech, low accessibility. And then it kind of just falls off. And at the bottom, it has to be high tech, it has to be low cost, and it has to be highly accessible. And it was really interesting to look at that and look at some examples of various things that have followed that trend. And I think when I look at innovation and where companies are at on that, I think it's important to pinpoint where they're at on that graph, or where the problem they're solving is, because it helps to kind of show you in terms of what might push you over the edge, right? Like computing power pushes you up that incline fast. I think to your point about Bluetooth, that's just like hey, we're kind of past that. You're over the mountain a little bit. That's not that. It's not pushing innovation there. So as you were talking, I had this graph in my head because I literally just quoted this same presentation yesterday in a presentation we did. So
Well,
it's yeah.
a couple other things to add on, just to, for completeness. And I think it follows along well with your example. Wearables, right? A Fitbit or smartwatch, they're not that expensive anymore. There's a lot of power in them. You can keep the same hardware for a long time, and the software is updating. To your point, the cost isn't necessarily going up, but the value is, and the accessibility is. Smartphone, similar. Not everybody had a smartphone right away. I can't say that they become inexpensive, but somehow everyone's found a way to have one. And then another thing that I think has moved the needle is COVID, right? COVID sort of forced a new modus operandi on all of us, where telemedicine and sort of remote monitoring, which were already trending, all of a sudden became essential, and adoption and willingness around those things also increased. And all these things that we're talking about, they are producers of data that is moving, off into the cloud and getting aggregated. And there's a lot of people looking at this saying, where is there value in this data? What can we derive from this? What can we, how can we get predictive as opposed to just reactive?
Yeah, and things take time, no matter how fast we're talking about innovation here. I think I had heard on the podcast a couple different times from physicians that even achieving full market adoption for any product, you should assume it's 10 years at least, based on a number of different factors. But the most interesting theory I had ever heard on the podcast was because of the duration of medical school, which was really interesting. But they essentially, the point was, medical school is 4 years, and it's a 4-year residency program. Then it's a 1-year fellowship, potentially 2-year fellowship, 3-year fellowship, and maybe have another fellowship after that. And so by it's all said and done, the people who are just graduating, they were just trained on everything that your product wasn't a part of, probably. Right. So if you weren't on the market during that time, they weren't trained on it. And so it's just interesting, because people are like, oh, well, I'll target a younger population because maybe they'll be more willing to adopt the technology, but that's not always the case. Right. So anyways, it was a fascinating theory onto why it takes so long. But I figured I'd share that because we hear so much stuff from the podcast.
And it's a good point. I mean, if the rate of change is so great that, what is the half-life of a technology? And it's a great point. That's 10 years, and a lot is changing in 10 years. We know that.
Yeah. Yep. So kind of moving through this a little bit, challenges. So we're covering the factors of innovation. We're covering the pace and the history lessons there. the challenges facing medtech R&D, this new pace of innovation. What does this create for medtech R&D companies?
Well, it it does create challenges, right? Any change, whether it's a change in regulation, a change in policy, a change in user preference and technology, that's something that needs to be adjusted to. And I think there is that. There's the rate of change. I also think that there's a complexity of many of these systems, right? If you're, again, a single box, a therapeutic medical device, you are able to put out a product, and we see this all the time where products have been out for, a decade or two, right? And it's not that they haven't evolved, but they've evolved slowly, and it's usually through, feedback from the market. Okay, we're going to add a feature here and there. When you have a medical device that's really part of an ecosystem, all of a sudden you have a lot more that's starting to come into play, right? And so that's part of the challenge, is that, if we think of sort of a very modern, leading medical device, you work with startups. I think, a lot of startups fit into this category, but, a lot of medical devices in general fit in this category. It's no longer a simple in the sense of here's the device and we're just thinking about the device. We're really thinking about an ecosystem. So we're thinking about an overall system that has a lot of different technologies incorporated into it, right? We IoT is a technology, or the medical IoT, or the Internet of Medical Things. You've got this connectivity, which there's mobile, there's wearables, right? There is user experience design that I was talking about with expectations around the iPhone. There's the cloud that we've been talking about, right? Galen data is sort of a solution for one of these challenges that I think is facing the industry, and I'll dig more into that in a minute. And then there's data, data modeling, data management, AI, which is, saying AI is sort of like saying software, right? And it's not there yet, but there's a lot of different types of software. I think it won't be too long before AI, we're looking at a similar thing. What kind of AI are we talking about? Are we talking about, analyzing images? Are we talking about looking at huge data sets, looking for pattern? Is it, generative AI, like, has gotten a lot of buzz? And obviously the machine learning that goes along with it. So you have these different technology areas that may not be core competency to an R&D organization. And part of the point of this is that the rate of change is hastening, and the complexity of systems and the number of different technologies involved, right? We talked about Bluetooth, let's throw that in as well with connectivity. All of a sudden you have more areas of technology that have specialized required skills that need to be incorporated in order to be successful. And that stresses R&D organizations, because they may be 20 years old and have grown up around a certain technology that's core, a diagnostic system, and the core technology is sort of, analyzing the different materials to determine, all right, is it positive, is it negative, is it present, is it not present? And all of these other technologies may not be part of their core competency, or even, in some cases, organizational competency. That's one layer. I think another layer is a lot of these technologies are also having corresponding regulation with them, right? AI, all of a sudden you've got the predetermined change control process, right? That is a term. It's part of relatively new regulation from the FDA on AI. That didn't exist 5 years ago, 3 years ago. That's new. Cybersecurity, that's not a new concern, but some of the regulation around cybersecurity is new and dramatic in some of the ways that it's changed, putting more responsibility on device manufacturers, which requires a level of expertise around this that they just may not have immediately, right? So there's all these different technology areas. Some of them are going to be core. Absolutely, companies are going to double down on them. Some of them are ones that they're going to want to incorporate and figure out quickly, and others, they might need to partner. Galen Data has a solution so that if you don't want to become, I heard this in the beginning, an IT company, Galen Data can take some of that off of your plate by having, a certified back-end cloud-based. That's a challenge. A lot of people are growing their own, but they don't necessarily have the competency to do it. So they're either hiring quickly, which has some dangers, or they're, partnering, or they're struggling, or some combination of all three.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so the Galen piece, helping medical device companies stay medical device companies, not become IT companies. For us, for our startups, that's crucial, right? There's enough on their plate. They need to be worrying about commercial success and a number of other things that, dealing with having an in-house expert to own this just doesn't make sense if it's not on their critical path, right? And so the one thing I wanted to touch on, because you brought up regulations, and I'll let you kind of get back to maybe answering this one. The regulation piece is interesting too, because for like, I guess back in, I think it was 1976, right? Is that when devices were first regulated by the FDA, something like that?
Mhm.
You know, there was that learning curve of, okay, well, now the industry and the FDA was learning together, but then at some point, the FDA got a pretty good grapple on regulating devices. Well, AI, machine learning, is just as new for them as it is for all of us in the industry. And so there is that, they're trying to come up to speed as well. So these regulations change frequently. How they interpret things within the FDA change frequently, right? Like, I look back to my own personal examples, and when chemical characterization became a real thing for biocompatibility testing, that was new for everybody in the industry, including the FDA. So how we evaluated safety of medical devices was different, and it felt like it was changing all the time within the FDA. It's the same thing with this, right? They're coming up to speed, they're trying to learn, and the industry's not slowing down. There's so much going on, and the FDA's job is to make sure it's a safe and effective product. And so it's difficult, especially when there's so much change coming out. And I think that's probably what some people don't realize is, when these people in this, they're like, wow, the FDA is doing this, the FDA is doing that. They're trying to figure it out too, right? And you have to put yourself in their shoes of what their duty is to American citizens, and it's to keep us safe, right? So, anyways, I just
Absolutely.
find
I think
that
I think
fascinating.
it's a great point, Dwayne, and I often say I don't envy the FDA, right? Because to your
Never.
point, they have the mandate to keep us safe, but they also have a mandate not to stifle innovation, right? So
Exactly.
they're balancing these two things,
Yeah.
and it's a little bit, it's hard to win, right? I mean, but I feel that they've done a good job. AI is not new. AI has been around for a long time, but sort of more mainstream AI and some of the use cases in healthcare are very new, and they've had to react quickly and come up with something that makes sense. And there's aspects of AI, machine learning AI, that challenges the traditional waterfall model of development, and not that waterfall is really a process that many follow these days. It's more agile, but in the sense of releasing a product, and if you're going to make a change, that requires sometimes a resubmission, right? And it depends on the nature of the change, and it depends on how significant that change is. But one of the points of AI machine learning is that you want that AI to improve as more and more data comes in. Well, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that where you're not stifling it, at the same time you're not releasing something that hasn't gone through the full vetting? And that's where this predetermined change control process came into place. If you can anticipate some of it, you have a faster path to making updates, as long as it's within a sort of expected direction. If it goes outside of those bounds, you're sort of back in that place of, all right, now we may have to have more of a regulatory burden.
Yep. So Matt, how are medtech companies reacting and adapting to all of this so far?
Well, it's there's a lot of variability in how people are reacting. There's certain things that we've seen, in the outsourced engineering space, outsourced product development. I used to see a lot of architectural needs. Going back 10 plus years, a lot of companies were new to architecture, as an example, and how do I architect my product? What are the drivers that really are going to help inform an architecture that makes sense for my desired outcomes and my goals? That went away a little bit. It wasn't as big a problem. A lot of people got in-house architecture, as an example, and that really became more of a competency more broadly. What we've seen recently is that these, it's not just the device, as I said, right? It's really a system, and that system has an architecture, and that overall system architecture has some aspects to it, both regulatory and technological, that are new, and that requires some thinking. I had mentioned in the beginning that the FDA is encouraging industry to really think about, in this overall system, look at what is medical device functionality and what isn't, right? Because there are aspects of these systems that aren't medical device, and if you can think about, from an architectural perspective, where you might want to concentrate your regulated functionality, you're making your life easier because you're having a higher burden of process and verification around those aspects, and having other non-medical device functionality really live elsewhere. That's a new lens to think about architecture, right? Which again, it's not new in terms of the concept of it, but I think in terms of the practical application of it, we're seeing a lot more need for thinking about architecture in a different way, and it's similar to around these regulations. So sometimes early on, you're bolting something on to an existing design or architecture, right? You have a new technology, go back to our friend Bluetooth. You can figure out a way to shoehorn Bluetooth interconnectivity into kind of an existing architecture. But as time goes on with AI and with sort of more of these distributed systems, the bolt-on really isn't sufficient. It really, and cybersecurity has this same quality. You need to be thinking about it from the beginning. It's very hard to design cybersecurity in later. It's not impossible, but it's harder. And with a lot of these things, there requires some upfront thinking. So what is, how is it affecting the industry? It is forcing people to think a little bit more in advance, right? Again, if it's an incremental update on an existing system, you're thinking about one way, more of a bolt-on. But companies we work with often have sort of legacy products, but they're at the same time thinking about the next generation. The next generation, there's a lot of new thinking going into, what does this next generation need to be today? What does it need to anticipate, in the next 5 or 10 years? And that's a very different set of thinking, and it requires, a lot more forethought so that you don't architect yourself into a corner, early. You want to have extensibility, you want to have longevity of these things. It really requires kind of thinking in a new way based on how the ecosystems have evolved and the way we're talking about it. But so how do they, accomplish this? This is some of the impacts I'm referring to. There was an article that Bain put out in the past several months that I found interesting, where they interviewed executives from technology companies, medical device included as a segment of it. But overall, 60% of technology executives plan to increase outsourcing over the next 3 years, right? So that's a sort of a big stat, particularly sitting where I am in my business. Why? What's driving that? I want to talk about the economics briefly. Right now you have the MedTech industry sitting a little north of $500 billion. That's the size of the market. You have digital health, which, broadly connected health, digital health, but digital health as a category didn't really exist 10 years ago. But, today it's about 140 billion, growing very quickly. 70% compound annual growth rate is about 7% for the MedTech industry. By 2030, this, industry that today is, about 650 billion, is going to be, closer to 1.5 trillion by 2030. And again, these projections, we read a lot of them, but that's a lot of growth, right? That's significant. Another factor, it's not just growth of the industry, but the average R&D spend within MedTech companies was about 7 or 8%. It's now over 10%, right, and growing. And that is because a lot of the factors that we're talking about, in order to stay competitive, you have to spend more on R&D, and you're spending in R&D in some cases in areas that, like I said, are not a core competency. So what do you do? Do you find a partner, right? Do you try to grow it organically? Do you try and buy it, right? And sometimes acquisitions are based on this, but and again, there's no one right strategy, but we are seeing people come to us for more of these areas that are critical for a successful product, but not necessarily core competency to what they've traditionally been good at. And that is a change. Another change we're seeing is that it's not just technological know-how that they're looking for, but really, and this was the #1 driver from the same Bain study that they did, industry expertise. So that they're looking for technological expertise in areas that they don't understand, that is coupled with industry expertise, and that might include some regulation for sure, but also context of use, right? I mean, if you're designing a mobile app that's for kids to play with versus a mobile app that a medical technician might be using for a medical purpose, it's a very different context of use. So let me take a breath, because I'm curious if you've seen any of these changes as well on your end.
I muted myself. Yeah, we see a lot of this as well. I think in our world, like the biggest thing we've been seeing more frequently is like a build to buy model, where a strategic is essentially asking, already engaged with a startup and saying, hey, as long as your technology works, we'll kind of buy it, right? Which almost acts like as an extension of this R&D arm that you're kind of referring to. There's been a lot more of that recently, which is really interesting. We also
could double click on that a little bit, Dwayne, because that resonates with something that we're seeing, and also again, it was it was talked about in some recent literature on this, including that Bain article. It's more of a partnership, right? So let's say if I'm a cloud expert, I can bring in resources, hire them or bring them from external shops if I need to, if I want to ramp up and down, and I can manage that work. I'm an expert in cloud. I've got cloud work to do. I can bring in people who, have the basic skills, but then I can bring them into an organization that knows how to develop cloud applications, host cloud, all of the above. But if you have an area that is new organizationally, you can't just bring people in and then sort of tell them what to do. You're looking for more of a strategic partnership where you're bringing a competency in. So you're bringing more in terms of the kind of leverage you can get out of them than just helping hands. It's really, filling an organizational competency gap. And, that can work out very well, right? And sometimes we see this also. There's an organizational competency gap. Time waits for no one. So an organization wants to fill that by building out their own team, but in the meantime, they need a bridge, right? Mm-hmm. So pulling in expertise. We did this with a company not long ago where cybersecurity was relatively new. We sort of came in as their cybersecurity experts from a artifacts for the design history file, what needs to happen, what needs to be in place for cybersecurity that did not need to be in place before some of these new regulations. We helped start managing some upcoming submissions they had, and then they hired a head of cybersecurity in that time, who we worked very closely with and continue to work with, but they're growing it internally, but they couldn't wait to find the right person, and the labor markets have eased a little bit, but for a while you couldn't even find people to hire, as you know.
Right, Matt. I would say in our world, because this is like the classic like pendulum, right? It swings too far one way, we start to come back a little bit, right?
Yep.
I feel like we got to a point where everyone wanted to do everything, right? And now it's starting to come back a little bit. So where we see it for us is hospital innovation groups, right? So we do a fair amount of work with some various hospital innovation groups across the US. And a lot of them have their own innovation departments, and they'll continue to have their own innovation departments because they know that innovation is important for them. However, we are seeing a fair amount of hospitals close their innovation department because they've kind of determined, they're good at identifying problems, but they're maybe not so great at innovating necessarily, or incubating those solutions, and they don't really know what to do with them, right? And so, that's kind of where we come in, is to say, look, you're a hospital system, you know where the problems lie, where are those at? We can come in, partner with you, and kind of help you with the planning and the execution of these individual ideas. What do we need to do to say, hey, this is a go or a no go, right? And so some hospitals, phenomenal innovation departments, right? Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, university hospitals, to name a few. Um, but then there's ones that are kind of closing up shop because maybe that's not their core competency, right? And so they still want to have an ability to take in innovation, but let someone else who really understands what to do with that come in and help them, right? So we are kind of seeing it in that side of the world. I want to ask you one more question that I had ready, and then we have 6 or 7 that are coming flying in here. So for those listening in, if you have questions, keep dropping them in, and we'll ask them here rapid fire in like 4 minutes. We'll leave like 10 minutes for it. Last question for you to end with, Matt, here from me is, for MedTech executives or MedTech leaders or whoever's listening into this webinar, how should they prepare their organization for the new pace of change?
Well, and that is the $1 million question. I think there's no future-proofing everything, right? But there are some approaches that I think really make sense. One is looking at, what is the nature of your product, right? What is your product ecosystem, and is it changing? In what ways is it changing? It's not your grandparents' Oldsmobile anymore, kind of thing. And really doing an evaluation of, it's sort of an organizational mapping. Here's our core technology. Here's how we've traditionally made money. Here are some things that are forcing us to do more, right? And we see this a lot. We talked about a lot of examples. Understanding what are the needs to be successful in the future versus yesterday. Where are the competency to address those needs, and where are the gaps, right? Really identifying those gaps, and in identifying those gaps, coming up with a strategy of how to fill them, right? And we talked about a lot of different ways to fill them, and there's no right answer. But I do think, to your pendulum example, it's hard to do everything well, right? If you're in a category where you find yourself in a more sprawling ecosystem than your device used to live in, and it may not be today, but it may be something that you see coming, right? Because I think it's coming to a lot of different medical devices. Really doing the work to figure out, what you have today. Are there gaps today? And there may not be. But as you look out and how you need to evolve, how do you need to evolve your organization to deal with these things? How do you need to adapt your architecture, not just based on the ways I was talking about it before, where's regulated functionality, where isn't regulated functionality, but also where within that overall architecture are there components that might be changing very rapidly, right? Because, people have talked about modular architectures for a long time, right? You want modularity typically, but in the case of a very rapidly changing technology, you may be plugging AI engines into your product as opposed to be developing them. That is not uncommon at all. The AI engine today that you might be plugging in for a certain use case may be great today, but who knows how it's going to evolve in 5 years? How might you swap that out without fundamentally disrupting your architecture, your product. So I think that there's a way to look at the product, the needs of the product, how to architect the product, the skills required to be competitive in the market with some of the new demands, where you have competency to fill those needs, and where you need to either grow, partner, or in some way fill in an organizational competency to stay competitive in the future, right? Because we hear this all the time. There is fear of disruption from a lot of incumbents, and thinking about how to stay ahead and incorporate these things so that they can enjoy successes tomorrow as much as they are today.
Awesome. All right. So some questions.
Let me bring Adam in here just so
Yeah.
We've got him. I know he's been introduced, but thought I'd have him join here as well.
Awesome. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
Yeah. So first question, do you think there'll be more or less AI in the medical device industry?
In the future?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was kind of laughing to myself watching a Home Depot ad where, the Home Depot app can now look at something that you have bought from Home Depot or that they have in stock. And if you can't think of, the name of it or the SKU, it will identify it, right?
Yeah.
And it's just, I see one of my favorites is actually, there's an app that you can look at a pile of Legos, and it will tell you a number of different things you can build with those Legos based on the pieces you have available.
Mm-hmm.
I say that because it is finding its way into a lot of different scenarios. We see a lot in imaging right now, right? That is the dominant use case for AI in healthcare right now. Most of the submissions that have been made to the FDA, and there are hundreds, including AI, are imaging based. But I do think it will grow, and I do think we're going to see a lot more AI pretty pervasively, including healthcare. Adam, I want you to take Adam's the technologist here.
No, I completely agree. One point of evidence for that is the FDA releasing guidance earlier this year. That's where the predetermined change control plan came from. And when the FDA does something like that, that's really a statement that we're seeing more of this, and we expect to continue to see even more. So we've got to establish a starting position so that we're able to really give appropriate guidance to industry so that they can essentially navigate the regulated process.
Yeah. So staying on AI, can you comment on training of AI algorithms? This is kind of like a data question. Training of AI algorithms out in the wild, meaning live training in a commercial regulated environment. Think pre-trained versus live training.
Yeah, I think the comment was made earlier in this discussion that we haven't seen anything that's being allowed to train and release itself in real time. Out in the wild. I think we're probably a ways from that. But again, I just referenced the predetermined change control plan. That's really how are you as essentially the developer, how are you regulating or managing change, whether it's in the wild or not? So I think that obviously that's the direction it's going. I'll be surprised if I see too many that are going to be fully, hands off, where it's essentially taking data in real time, learning in real time in the way that you would see in the consumer industry. But that is absolutely the direction that I see it going.
Okay. So I think staying on that, we just had one come in and it said, how concerned are you about the integrity, validity of generative AI in healthcare data analytics exclusive of imaging data?
Well, I mean, what data set is it drawing from, right? With the ChatGPT, it's drawing from an enormous, very uncontrolled data set. I was speaking to a company the other day that is more in the pharmaceutical research space. They are training their AI on very specific controlled sources, right? And so it's a very similar kind of thing, but they're pulling the data from a controlled environment. To me, those are very different things, and you have you got to know where this data is coming from, and that has to do with really any kind of AI, generative or not, is that data and the provenance of that data and the validity of that data. But I'll let you add.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, again, the application of the same technology that you would apply in the consumer space versus healthcare is completely different. You absolutely have to be able to source that data. So whatever trained your model, that's important to being able to troubleshoot. Like what confused the model, right? So you have to be able to do those types of forensics. That again wouldn't be required in the consumer space, but in healthcare, absolutely going to be required.
Awesome. This one is QMS. So there's quite a few questions about QMS and software.
Yeah.
So software as a medical device, no hardware. How worried should they be about developing their software under a QMS or design control?
Yeah, we did a webinar on software as a medical device for software in a medical device recently. A lot of the regulations are I mean, they're similar. It's really the same processes applied to both, but the context of use is different, and some of the challenges you have around control over the platform and how much testing you want to do on how many platforms and OSs and versions of OSs, are one of the things to consider. But Adam, compliance is something we deal with all the time.
I mean, I think we talk a lot about change from that perspective, but I think a lot of things are unchanged, right? The expectation that we control the way the product is being developed under a quality system is gonna persist. How we apply that does change as the technology changes and the risk changes. But I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think the concern is consistent with what we've all been developing for a number of years.
Yeah, I mean, to pointedly try to address the question, there isn't a lot of difference from a regulatory standpoint. The processes you need to follow, the artifacts that you need to create under a quality management system for software as a medical device versus software in a medical device. A lot of it is just more contextually there are differences. So those rules and processes might apply a little differently, but they're equally valid and necessary in both cases.
Yeah, that's helpful. One more question, and then we'll wrap it up here. If I have a class 2 medical device that I want to access the data remotely, does the cloud need to be built under a QMS?
Not necessarily. So again, devil's in the details, but you have HIPAA that you have to think about, but yeah. You might be aggregating data on a back-end cloud that you're doing research on, right? And there's permissions and all kinds of things to think about. The question is specifically about, does it need to be regulated? If it depends on the functionality happening in the cloud. If it's research only, there's no medical decisions being made based on that, then no, not necessarily. If that data is going, a lot of systems have data going to the cloud, the data is being analyzed, and some kind of insight or direction or decision is being made based on that, or a diagnosis, then okay, you're very much in the realm of that's a medical device, and all of this regulation applies, which kind of goes back to that architectural question I was talking about. You don't want too many areas of your system performing medical device functionality if it's avoidable.
Okay. Adam, anything to add?
I think privacy is your number one concern. If we assume that we're not making any medical decisions in the cloud, privacy becomes the biggest issue, particularly if you're drawing data from multiple geographies. So if you're pulling patient data from both Europe and US, there are operational controls, clearly cybersecurity, but operational controls put in place by things like GDPR if you're pulling data from places like Europe.
Great. Okay, with that, Matt, Adam, thank you so much for your time. For those listening in or watching this later, you can see Matt, Adam, and Full Spectrum's website on the page there. You can also see Galen Data's website and also a place to reach out to Galen Data as well. As a reminder, the next webinar will actually be October 31st on Halloween. So spooky webinar. It'll be with Ken Nelson, and it'll be on launching disruptive products and building your commercialization team. So more information to come on that soon. We'll put out the poster, the link to sign up. But if you're interested, October 31st, we'll be having the next webinar. Matt, Adam, thank you so much for the dialogue, but then also answering the questions from the audience at the end. I'll share one other, not question, but comment, and it was that this was excellent, and thank you. So that goes to both of you. So thanks for joining, and thanks everyone for listening in. Again, thanks for joining the Galen Data webinar series.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thank you.